December 7th, 1941. The last Japanese bomb had struck Pearl Harbor only minutes earlier when a startling realization entered the mind of the man who helped design the attack. The US Pacific Fleet lay in ruins, Arizona exploding, Oklahoma rolled over, and battleships burning in rows. Yet behind all that destruction stood something far more important. The fuel farms, massive tanks holding nearly the entire forward oil reserve of the United States Navy. They had not been hit. Not one. Commander Minoru Genda understood instantly what this meant. He knew exactly how many barrels Japan imported, how few it produced, and how fast a carrier strike group consumed fuel at war tempo. He knew the math Japan had tried to ignore. America could rebuild ships, Japan could not rebuild oil. And as the task force turned north, Genda realized the truth buried beneath the smoke. Japan's greatest tactical triumph had just collided with an industrial reality so one-sided that the long war many had assumed would never happen was now unavoidable. Genda understood this not as a hunch, but as arithmetic he had already tested against Japan's own situation. He had seen the tables showing how much oil the empire imported each year, and how little it produced at home. He knew how quickly a modern fleet could turn those static numbers into empty gauges when operating at war tempo, rather than peacetime cruising speeds. The attack that morning had been daring, brilliantly executed and tactically devastating. Yet as Akagi's deck crews lashed down returning aircraft and the task force turned north for home, Genda's calculations pointed in a different direction. Japan had opened a war in the Pacific with no realistic way to replace the fuel it was about to burn. It had struck first at an enemy who, even wounded, possessed an industrial base many times larger than its own. That disparity would not appear in any combat report from Pearl Harbor. It existed in ledgers, in oil fields, in tanker fleets, and in assumptions made months earlier in quiet conference rooms in Tokyo. On that calm December morning, as smoke rose over Oahu and cheers echoed across Akagi's deck, the numbers in Minoru Genda's head were already hinting at a truth the Empire was not yet willing to face. That the coming war would be decided as much by fuel arithmetic as by torpedoes and bombs. Tokyo, summer 1941. The city moved under a shroud of ration cards and patriotic slogans while, in offices lined with maps and ledgers, a different war was being fought with pencils and slide rules. Japan's navy, the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, burned oil it did not have. Nearly 90% of the empire's petroleum flowed in from abroad. American West Coast refineries, Dutch East Indies fields, British-controlled ports. When the United States froze Japanese assets and halted oil exports in July 1941, followed swiftly by British and Dutch embargoes, the effect was invisible on the streets, but devastating in the ledgers. Overnight, peacetime imports collapsed. What remained were finite stocks in steel tanks and underground reservoirs, a strategic reserve measured in tens of millions of barrels that would only shrink. Inside naval staff rooms, officers like Captain Kantaro Suzuki and the eccentric strategist Captain Katsuhiro Kurashima laid the Empire's future across the table in columns of figures. They knew how much oil the IJN burned at cruising speed, how much the army demanded for operations in China, how much industry and civilians required to keep the home islands functioning at a bare minimum. Charts showed total reserves of roughly 50 million barrels scattered between Navy depots, Army stocks, and civilian emergency stores. At peacetime usage, that seemed manageable. At war tempo, it could vanish with frightening speed. The numbers forced a binary question. Could Japan back away from confrontation, accept American demands to withdraw from China and French Indochina, and stretch those reserves while seeking a diplomatic escape? Or would it gamble everything on a rapid seizure of the southern resource area, Borneo, Sumatra, Java, before the tanks ran dry? Reports warning that any prolonged conflict with the United States would be unwinnable were acknowledged, then set aside. Planning staffs were directed to assume war was coming, and to calculate how long Japan could continue to fight if it seized the oil fields of Southeast Asia quickly and completely. Kurashima and his colleagues set to work. They added projected production from Dutch and British concessions to existing reserves, subtracted estimated Army and Navy consumption, and produced tables that appeared to show a narrow but workable path. If the war were short, if operations followed existing decisive battle doctrine, if captured fields could be restored rapidly and tankers moved without intolerable losses, the lines just barely intersected in Japan's favour. on the sheets of paper that circulated through the Navy Ministry that summer, those conditional curves became accepted reality. The caveats attached to them, the fragile ifs that kept the columns in balance, were steadily pushed to the margins. In their place grew a confidence that the Empire could fight the United States, Britain and the Netherlands at once and not exhaust its fuel. Long before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the crucial choice had been made: to believe the most optimistic version of the math and to build a war plan on it. For Japan's senior leadership, the most dangerous assumption of 1941 never appeared in any fuel table or tanker inventory. It lived in culture, in the strategic mythology the Imperial Japanese Navy had carried for decades. Every officer of standing had been raised beneath the shadow of Tsushima, the 1905 victory where Japanese guns annihilated Russia's Baltic fleet in a single, overwhelming clash. That triumph had become more than the memory, it became doctrine. War games at the Naval War College reenacted it. Strategy texts taught it. Political leaders celebrated it. The fleet would wait, strength conserved, until the enemy steamed into range for a decisive battle that would determine the entire course of a war in one violent afternoon. In 1941, this belief shaped everything. Fuel planning, ship deployment, even pilot training rhythms were built around the expectation that a war with the United States would be sharp, brutal, and finished in 6 to 8 months. Reports circulated confidently describing Americans as commercially minded, dependent on comfort, and unwilling to sustain heavy casualties. Once battleships sank and distant island bases fell, these analyses predicted Washington would negotiate. Japan would hold its gains in China and Southeast Asia. The Empire's oil lines would stabilize. The decisive battle doctrine would be vindicated again. That conviction allowed planners to draw fuel curves that stopped early, before the reserve tanks bottomed out. They projected destroyers and cruisers burning fuel at cruising speeds, not at the punishing rates of carrier escort and night fighting. They assumed aircraft losses would be high but manageable. Replacements would arrive just in time. Most of all, they assumed war would not evolve into a grinding test of industry. In this imagined timeline, battleships and aircraft carriers would not require years of continuous operation across thousands of miles. The war would be won long before such demands appeared. Yet even as staff officers sketched those reassuring timelines, other documents slipped across the same desks. American production forecasts showed shipyards in California capable of launching destroyers and carriers in numbers Japan could not match. Reports from the Dutch East Indies detailed output far below the ideal figures used in Japanese planning tables. Intelligence summaries noted increases in US Army and Navy aviation training throughput, outpacing Japanese pilot programs by orders of magnitude. The contradiction was not hidden, it simply went unspoken. A few officers, reading both sets of reports, understood what the numbers implied. If the war lasted longer than the doctrine predicted, the Empire's fuel reserves would collapse long before American industrial capacity did. But raising that warning meant challenging not just calculations, but identity, the very belief system upon which the Navy understood itself. In an institution that equated doubt with weakness and pessimism with disloyalty, silence became the path of survival. The fleet prepared for a short war because it needed the war to be short. And in that quiet, unchallenged desire, the first fault line in Japan's grand strategy opened wide.
If you're enjoying this documentary, please like the video and share it with fellow World War II enthusiasts. Hit subscribe as well. Your support really matters and keeps this channel moving forward.
The first weeks after Pearl Harbor seemed to validate every optimistic projection. Japanese forces advanced across the Pacific with speed and precision. Hong Kong fell, Manila fell, Singapore collapsed in February 1942, stunning the British Empire. Reports celebrating each success circulated through headquarters in Tokyo, reinforcing the idea that the war was unfolding exactly as envisioned. Yet beneath those headlines, a different set of figures began to rise in importance: fuel consumption logs arriving from the fleet. The decisive battle doctrine had assumed ships would spend much of their time anchored, burning minimal oil as they waited for the US Pacific Fleet to approach. Reality delivered the opposite. Modern naval warfare demanded motion, constant, exhausting, fuel-intensive motion. Destroyers that consumed manageable amounts at 14 knots now spent days running at 28 or 30 knots on night patrols, anti-submarine screens and convoy escorts between Rebelle, Truk and the Solomons. Each sprint burned through tons of fuel, and there was no pause in the schedule. Carriers, which peacetime planners had imagined holding back for a single climactic battle, instead became long-range raiders, crossing vast distances to strike Darwin, Ceylon, and bases throughout the Indian Ocean. Each sortie consumed thousands of barrels of precious oil. By mid-1942, hard numbers confronted the assumptions of 1941. Tankers returning to Japan reported lighter loads than expected. Some arrived nearly empty. Fleet oilers transmitted increasingly urgent warnings about thin margins, reporting that their own voyages were now consuming more fuel than planned as they zigzagged to avoid submarine threats. Internal IJN figures revealed that reserves had begun dropping at a pace far exceeding pre-war estimates. What had been expected to last more than a year now looked dangerously finite. The Guadalcanal campaign exposed these weaknesses brutally. Night battles fought at high speed, reinforcement convoys racing the clock, destroyers pressed into transport duty at the Tokyo Express. Each operation drained fuel at a rate no one had planned for. Even victories cost dearly. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, tactically impressive for Japan, left carriers depleted not only in aircraft and pilots but in oil, forcing withdrawals dictated not by strategy but by the level of fuel remaining in the tanks. By the end of 1942, the question gripping planners had shifted. No longer, can we win quickly, but something harsher. How fast are we burning through the possibility of winning at all? Every chart updated in Tokyo sharpened the same conclusion. The lines were diverging, consumption rising, reserves falling, and the war stretching into a length the original calculations had never allowed. In the gap between those lines, the shape of Japan's coming crisis was beginning to appear. The second great assumption, that capturing the Dutch East Indies would solve Japan's fuel problem, began to unravel almost the moment Japanese troops set foot on Borneo and Sumatra. On pre-war planning charts in Tokyo, these territories glowed as vast, reservoir of salvation, producing tens of millions of barrels each year for Royal Dutch Shell and Standard Vacuum. The logic seemed simple. Seize the wells quickly, restore operations, and let the oil flow north in an unbroken stream. But when Japanese forces reached Balikpapan, Tarakan and Palembang in early 1942, the reality that greeted them bore little resemblance to the confident figures written into staff plans just months earlier. Allied engineers retreating under fire had executed a methodical demolition campaign. Wells were set ablaze, shooting pillars of flame into the sky. Storage tanks lay ripped open, their contents draining into the soil in black spreading lakes. Pumping stations were wrecked down to their foundations. Electrical systems were stripped, control panels smashed, and the delicate machinery needed to refine crude into usable fuel had vanished, pulled apart, booby-trapped, or dumped into rivers. Even facilities that appeared outwardly untouched hid quieter forms of sabotage. Missing valves, misaligned shafts, cracked seals, and damaged pipes that would only reveal themselves under load. Knowledge proved an even greater obstacle than wrecked steel. Japan's domestic petroleum industry was small. It relied on modest fields in places like Akita and Niigata and lacked large cadres of experienced petroleum engineers. Running tropical oil fields required specialists familiar with the geology, the climate, and the refinery systems the Dutch and British had developed over decades. Most of those Western technicians had evacuated before capture. Those who remained were imprisoned rather than conscripted, deemed security risks in a war Japan believed it could win without their help. That decision left fields in the hands of Japanese engineers flown in from the home islands, men skilled in chemistry or mining, but often unfamiliar with the specific demands of large-scale petroleum extraction. As months passed, production did rise. Fires were extinguished. Some wells sputtered back to life. Crude began to move into patched storage tanks, but the output lagged far behind the optimistic projections of 1941. Where planners had counted on 65 million barrels per year, the approximate pre-war figure, the repaired fields struggled to deliver even half that. Worse, the flow remained fragile. A single mechanical failure, a shortage of spare parts, or an air raid could knock entire facilities offline. The oil existed in the ground. No one doubted that. But turning that potential into steady streams of fuel moving toward Japan required a level of manpower, equipment, and uninterrupted logistics that Japan did not possess in 1942. Every barrel produced in the Dutch East Indies represented a victory of skill and improvisation. Yet each one also underscored a darker truth. The Empire had counted on ideal conditions that wartime reality would never allow. Oil that could not be reached in time, or in sufficient quantity, was nearly as useless as oil that did not exist, and by late 1942 it was becoming clear that Japan's war effort was built on a supply line that the Empire could not repair fast enough to save itself. Even if the Dutch East Indies had produced every barrel Japan hoped for, a brutal logistical fact stood between that oil and the home islands. It all had to travel more than 2,000 nautical miles across hostile waters. In the planning sessions of 1941, shipping had been treated as a clean mathematical variable, tanker capacity multiplied by annual trips, divided neatly into projected volumes delivered to Japan. What those tables never accounted for was the vulnerability of those tankers, the limits of Japan's shipbuilding infrastructure, or the speed at which the United States could turn the Pacific into a killing ground for merchant shipping. A typical Japanese tanker in 1941 carried roughly 75,000 barrels of oil. At an economical speed of 11 to 12 knots, the round trip from Borneo or Sumatra to Japan took 4 weeks when weather cooperated and when routes were straight. But war made routes crooked. Zigzagging to avoid submarines extended voyages. Convoying slowed traffic further. Refits, boiler cleaning and emergency repairs ate into schedules. At best, a single tanker could make a dozen voyages in a year. To move 40 to 50 million barrels, the volume Japan needed to sustain military operations, the Empire required a fleet of dozens of tankers operating without interruption or loss. It did not have them. Japan entered the war with fewer than 50 ocean-going tankers suitable for long-range transport, most already committed to peacetime trade or naval support. Instead of expanding that number before the conflict, the Navy had prioritized warships, destroyers, cruisers, submarines, and carriers. Tankers, unglamorous and defenseless, never won a budget battle. When war began, the Empire found itself fighting an industrial superpower with a merchant fleet too small to support the vast area it intended to conquer. American submarines exploited that fact with deadly clarity, operating under a doctrine that placed logistics, not warships, at the top of their target list. US boats positioned themselves along predictable routes: the Luzon Strait, the South China Sea, the approaches to Formosa. Tankers had no choice but to pass through these narrow funnels. One well-placed torpedo strike could vaporize thousands of barrels of future sorties, future patrols, future battles. As the sinkings mounted, a vicious cycle emerged. Each tanker lost required the remaining fleet to make more voyages. More voyages meant more time at sea. More time at sea meant more chances for submarines to strike. Shipyards in Japan, already running at near maximum capacity to replace combat losses, could not build tankers fast enough to compensate. Even when steel and labour were available, a new tanker required 8 to 10 months to complete. Time Japan no longer had. Captains of surviving tankers, fully aware of the danger, began choosing longer, circuitous paths, hugging coastlines or weaving through archipelagos, adding weeks to each journey and reducing total annual throughput. By 1943, the outcome of this overlooked variable became impossible to hide. Oil was pooling uselessly in storage tanks in the Dutch East Indies, while ships in Japan sat with half-empty bunkers. Production capacity was no longer the limiting factor. Transportation was. In that gap between the oil that existed and the oil Japan could actually move, the Empire's war machine began to stall. It had miscalculated not only how much fuel it needed, but how fragile the supply line delivering it truly was. By 1943, every headquarters in Tokyo, Navy, Army, and government ministries alike, had seen a version of the same chart. It showed 3 lines: reserves curving steadily downward, imports from the south plateauing far below projections, and consumption lines remaining stubbornly high. The gap between them widened each month. On maps and in political speeches, the Empire still appeared to be advancing. In the numbers, it was already falling behind. What had begun as a mathematical tension in 1941 was now becoming a strategic suffocation. Inside windowless conference rooms, committees gathered to produce remedies that sounded bold but collapsed under scrutiny. One proposal demanded urgent construction of 50 new tankers, an attempt to brute force capacity back into the system. But shipyards already strained to replace destroyers lost at Guadalcanal, and submarines sunk in the Aleutians. Steel allocations favoured warships, skilled workers were exhausted, slipways were full. Even if every shipyard abandoned its naval programs overnight, the first tankers would not arrive for 8 to 10 months. Japan didn't have that time. Another idea called for drastic operational restrictions. Carrier air groups were instructed to reduce training flights. Destroyers were ordered to remain idle unless their missions were essential. Submarines were told to shorten patrols. Fuel would be saved, but at the steep cost of combat readiness. Meanwhile, American carrier groups were expanding their reach, supported by an endless train of fleet oilers that allowed them to roam freely from the Gilberts to the Marshalls and beyond. Still more proposals attempted to alter the physics of the problem rather than its arithmetic. Japan moved major fleet units to Singapore and later to the Linga roads near Borneo so they could refuel directly from oil fields without relying on tankers. Strategically, the move was disastrous. The fleet was now thousands of miles from the Central Pacific battles that shaped the war's momentum. When American forces attacked the Gilberts, then the Marshalls, then the Marianas, much of the combined fleet was too far away and too short on refined fuel to intervene quickly or decisively. At sea, commanders experimented with burning lower-grade crude oil directly in warship boilers. The results were predictable: clogged tubes, fouled engines, rising maintenance demands, and ships forced into dock for cleaning far more often than planners had ever anticipated. Each forced withdrawal consumed time and manpower Japan lacked. Synthetic fuel projects in Manchuria appeared promising on paper, but the facilities were incomplete and the technology immature. They could not manufacture the millions of barrels needed to alter the course of the war. Amid all this, a handful of officers quietly referenced the original calculations from early 1941. Men like Captain Katsuhiro Kurashima saw the deficit for what it was: a structural mismatch between need and supply that no late-war improvisation could erase. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, long skeptical of Japan's ability to sustain a prolonged conflict, continued reading fuel reports that matched his darkest expectations. His letters and staff comments circled around the same point. Bravery and skill could win battles, but only fuel could sustain campaigns. Yet in a military culture where pessimism was equated with defeatism, such warnings rarely travelled beyond private conversations. Raising objections in official meetings risked reputations, careers, and in extreme cases even accusations of disloyalty. So the silence persisted, and in that silence the war continued, burning through the last of Japan's strategic margin, while the Americans closed in with the logistics system that seemed limitless. By the end of 1943, the empire remained outwardly fierce, but its fuel reality was narrowing into a corridor from which there would be no escape. By 1944, Japan's fuel crisis had evolved from a growing concern into a suffocating certainty. Across the Pacific, destroyers tasked with escorting convoys to the Philippines sailed with barely enough fuel to reach their destinations, let alone conduct extended patrols. A single unplanned detour, whether chasing a submarine contact or avoiding an air threat, could leave a ship limping into port on fumes or drifting helplessly, awaiting a tow that might never come. Air groups on distant islands counted flight hours not by training needs but by available barrels. Some fighter units practiced maneuvers on foot to conserve aviation fuel. Meanwhile, American naval forces operated with a freedom Japan could no longer imagine. The US Navy's fleet oilers, hundreds of thousands of tons of tanker capacity moving in disciplined convoys, allowed carrier groups to refuel at sea, extend operations indefinitely, and strike targets across thousands of miles. Battles Japan hoped would be decided by courage or tactical daring were increasingly shaped by logistics before a single aircraft launched. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 revealed this disparity with cruel clarity. Japanese carriers entered the engagement with limited fuel reserves, unable to maneuver aggressively or reposition rapidly. Every course change, every increase in speed consumed resources they could not spare. American forces, by contrast, fought with tanks full and replenishment ships at their backs. The result was a one-sided contest in which Japan's remaining naval aviation was shattered. The cause lay not only in training or aircraft quality, but in the simple physics of fuel availability. As Japan retreated toward its home islands, the situation worsened. Tankers continued to vanish under submarine attacks. The oil fields in Borneo and Sumatra still produced barrels, but fewer and fewer ships remained to carry that oil north. Some facilities overflowed, their storage tanks topped off because there were no hulls left to load them. The Empire had succeeded in seizing oil, yet failed to create the means to transport it, an irony that planners in 1941 had never anticipated. In April 1945, the battleship Yamato embarked on her final sortie toward Okinawa under what Japanese commanders understood to be a suicide mission. Even generous local officers at Tokuyama could provide her with only a partial refueling, barely enough to reach Okinawa, engage the enemy, and perhaps lash herself ashore as a stationary gun platform. Yamato's departure symbolized more than desperation. It marked the end of Japan's ability to deploy major naval forces in meaningful operations. There was simply not enough fuel left. By the summer of 1945, the combined fleet had ceased to exist as an operational entity. Some ships remained afloat, but their bunkers were empty. Air units stood down for lack of aviation gas. Transport networks withered. The oil fields Japan had fought so fiercely to seize still pulsed beneath tropical heat, but the tankers to move that oil lay at the bottom of the sea. The Empire surrendered in August 1945 not simply because its cities burned or its armies were exhausted, but because the silent arithmetic that had underpinned its war effort finally reached zero. The war that began with rising smoke over Oahu ended in stillness, ships intact but motionless, steel without power, a fleet unable to move. And in that stillness lay the final confirmation of what a few officers had understood from the beginning, that the conflict's outcome had been written not only in battles but in barrels, voyages, and calculations made long before the first wave launched.
If you've made it this far, you're one of us, searching for the truth behind the headlines and the courage behind the silence. Subscribe to the channel, and let's keep exploring the hidden wars, secret operations, and untold fates that shape the world we live in.